Hey y'all, I'm Ash Vampire, and welcome to the second edition of Shoring Up Against, where we talk about the shows that are actually garbage, or at least close to it. This week, we're going to be talking about Comic Girls, which, when it came out, seemed like, for many, a spot in the darkness. When Comic Girls came out, there were not very many good shows in the season that it was released, and Comic Girls was seen as competent enough to actually be something worth watching at the time. This is why I initially picked it up, because I had heard that the more recent shows that were coming out, Comic Girls was the most competent. It was the most well put together for what was out there. And when I ended up watching it, my immediate first reaction was, why did I pick this up? Why on earth did I choose to watch this? And I think that the only reason that I ended up actually finishing Comic Girls and therefore had something to say about it on Shoring Up is that it's only one core. It's only 13 episodes. So in the position that I was in, where I really didn't have very much else to do, what else was I going to do? I figured, all right, fine, I'll finish it, and I'll have some interesting things to say with regard to shows like this in the future. So here we are. Comic Girls runs into a problem very early on in its genre, in what kind of show it chooses to be. Because Comic Girls is just a for-girls show, and this is a market that is blown, it's overblown. Let's be real, it's oversaturated, it's overblown. There's tons of shows. I mean, there's a new one out in summer of 2019, the weightlifting show, which I don't want to talk about. But that being the case, you have to set yourself apart in some way, which is why so many of these shows tend to be gimmick-focused, right? They tend to be about a very isolated group of people, a very specific typography of people, if you will. And in this case, it just so happens to be manga artists, but I mean, it really could just be anything. But the real problem for Comic Girls is that it exists in the same world that Kaos-chan exists in. And this is a problem that is actually more exemplified by the isekai genre right now, because in a world where you have all of these isekai shows, it'd be one thing if they were all mediocre and you just kind of had to choose the one that was the most appealing to you. But unfortunately, in the world we live in now, Log Horizon and Konosuba exist, and they therefore make all of the other isekai shows look like actual trash, because there's just not that level of finesse. The execution on those two shows is so much higher that it inherently causes the other shows in the same genre to look not as good, even if they do have certain elements about them that are done well. And this is basically what has happened to Comic Girls. It is fine. Comic Girls doesn't do anything offensive per se. It's not bad in the typical sense. Its problem comes from the fact that it really is just a trope. It's one giant trope made by stacking as many different tropes on top of each other as you can possibly fit into 22 minutes every episode. And in a world where Kaos-chan exists, and that's not the case, and there is finesse in execution, and there is a sense that these characters are actual people as opposed to just simply archetypes, Comic Girls just doesn't stack up. Even if it is funny, even if it is not offensive, it doesn't insult my intelligence as a viewer, it's still not going to come across as nearly as interesting as something like Kaos-chan, which I know for some people is going to be a real shame, because for a show that is at least competent at what it does try to do, it kind of seems unfair in a way, doesn't it, that it's not, I don't consider it to be particularly well created simply because it exists, side by side with one of the best anime ever made. But I mean, that's the nature of media, I mean, that's why this show exists, that's why we have scores, that's why people review. I mean, that's basically the reason for the existence of all of, AniTube. But the reason for criticism and analysis is because you have so much stuff that you need to be able to pick apart why one thing is not better to another, and often it is because it is in relation to something else. If we're going to get into the specific reasons why Comic Girls is as not good as it is, because it's not as though it is absolutely terrible. It just doesn't do anything interesting. One of the biggest signposts for this is the fact that all of the girls are essentially color-coded. And I mean that in terms of like their hair colors. The problem with this is not necessarily that it is done, because anime tends to do this just generally speaking. If you see a pink-haired girl, she is probably going to be the main character, and wouldn't you know, in Comic Girls, that's exactly who she is. But it's one thing to use tropes as a base, right? That's what they're there for, right? Tropes are not inherently a bad idea. What they do is allow a common starting point so that not only can the creator work from something pre-established that is known to work effectively, that, you know, you can take all of these elements of a character that you have seen work well before, and you can kind of, you know, tweak this here, or, you know, adjust this, you know, one element to make a more unique identity. And also it helps the audience, because as a trope gains in longevity and it gains in repetition throughout media, you begin to be able to form an assumption on how things are going to go down within that media. And then when they don't do that, it becomes like a whoa, wow, like that's actually really different, and you can appreciate it more. So tropes are useful. But the problem is when you have something like Comic Girls where it just sticks to just the trope, where it's not used as a building block. Like, it is just the building block. There's nothing to it aside from everything that is pre-established. There's no interest, there's no intrigue. You can predict everything that's going to happen in Comic Girls coming from a mile away, just because you know what the girls' personalities are going to be because their hair is a certain color. And I don't have real significant problems with this so much as it just makes it boring. It makes the episode less engaging. I can't begin to like actually care about these, you know, these individuals as characters. And it honestly sometimes will make the jokes come across less funny because you realize, oh, well, that's where the joke is gonna go. Of course it is. And, you know, relying on tropes too much like Comic Girls does invariably will make your show less quality because it feels less creative. Another one of the things where we have to kind of compare Comic Girls to better shows like Kaos-chan is that Comic Girls immediately sets itself up as a comedy. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's probably a good thing, especially for Comic Girls considering all the other problems it has. Because in a show like Kaos-chan, there is not a real through line of tone. Kaos-chan will bounce between lighthearted elements, more serious elements, more emotional stuff, and this helps Kaos-chan feel much more real. It feels like actual life in the way that it kind of moves unpredictably through how you are taking in the environment on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis. But Comic Girls is a comedy, and it's much more focused, and that does help it because it needs every little bit of help it can get. But unfortunately, where just the idea of tone being consistent is helpful, when it comes to actually being comedic, being funny, it kind of falls apart because it's just not funny. Comic Girls has maybe one or two jokes over its entire runtime that had me actually chuckle genuinely a little bit. But by and large, the biggest problem with Comic Girls' comedy is the fact that so much of it is just based on the tropes that we discussed. Just like anime has very specific stereotypes, very specific archetypes for the characters that Comic Girls 100% plays into, it also has the same kind of thing for types of jokes and also settings, and I mean, you could basically label almost every single component to a show's overall structure and construction. There is a trope for it in anime. And with the comedy of Comic Girls, it just falls into the same trap. The jokes are just basically the same thing that we have seen over and over. None of them are interesting in how they are led up to. Like, you realize immediately what joke is being set up to if it's a particularly long one. You know, the more long-running jokes, the more, like, the shorter ones that just happen, you know, throughout the show very quickly get boring. It's just not there. And unfortunately, this keeps Comic Girls from having an element that allows it to be, like, bearable. Because even if you are a trope-laden show, if you have some particular element that allows you to stand out, like be it good character design, good writing, if you have one thing, just one singular element that can be latched onto by an audience as being like, I am here for this thing, then you become something that at least has something that people can point to and say, hey, this is why I watched this show, this is why I watched Comic Girls. But it just doesn't have that. The one thing that it had going for it, once you realize that it's not going to deliver on any other department, is the comedy, and then it just completely just falls right back into the same railroad that everything else in Comic Girls really is set on. But lastly, we have to talk about the one thing in Comic Girls that prevents it from being much, much lower in my scores than it would otherwise have been. Because Comic Girls does something that it almost doesn't earn the right to do, but it does it with such a level of sincerity, and a surprising level of sincerity at that, that I had to actually look at that one moment, that one scene, and actually consider that, okay, in this moment, at least this one singular moment, this show actually has something to say, and it does it well. And what I'm referring to is near the end of the show, all of the characters, all the girls, they gather up all of their old manuscripts, all of their failed ideas, all of their ideas that, it never eventuated to anything, all of the, sketches, everything that they have created that basically ended up not going anywhere. They gather all of these up, and they take them outside. They build a small pit fire, and they burn them. All of it. They get rid of all of it. And this has a level of artistic resonance for anybody who is creatively inclined that just, it's like, where did this come from? This is Comic Girls. This is a show that is just not good. How did it get this in here? Because this idea of being able to recognize that you are not always going to succeed, that you are going to end up running up against walls with a lot of your ideas and a lot of your efforts, and being able to let go of that, being able to admit that holding onto this idea is never going to allow me to move forward, and that in order to actually continue to grow as an artist, I have to let go of the things that were failures, that the idea of keeping them around is only actually keeping me back, that these are actually chains, that as long as I have learned from this mistake, there's no reason for it to continue to exist in my life. It is actually unhealthy. That is such a important idea, and it's one that I think so many creative people, including myself, we forget it a lot, that not everything that you make is going to be good, and that not everything you make deserves to see the light of day or ever be revisited ever again. Sometimes you do fail. And the important part is not just that you learn from that experience, but that you were able to move past it, that you actually internalize the lesson that you were taught through that failure. Again, Comic Girls almost doesn't deserve to have this kind of message put into it at any point. It doesn't really earn it. It doesn't really have the tone set to actually pull it off. And yet somehow it manages to do it in a very beautiful, sincere, and succinct way. And for that, Comic Girls actually ends up being something that I almost scored to be not low enough for shoring up against. It sat right on the edge for a while until I, just admitted that one element does not allow a show to, earn the right to be at a higher score. So with all of that said, we have to give Comic Girls a 4. And I encourage you to not watch it ever at all. Catch you on the flip side.